When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini took power, many thought the revolution was mainly about ending the rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. But very quickly, something else became clear. The new system was reshaping daily life, especially for women. Public punishments over dress and behavior became part of a larger plan to control how society looked, acted, and even thought. Long before 1979, Khomeini had already built a very firm belief about how society should look and behave. It goes back to the 1940s and 1960s, when he was still a religious teacher in Qom. In 1943, he wrote a book called Kashf al-Ashrar, in which he attacked what he saw as moral decline under Iran's monarchy. At that time, Iran was ruled by Reza Shah, and later by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Reza Shah had already banned the veil in 1936 as part of his modernization program. Women were forced to remove it in public. For many religious families, that humiliation stayed in memory for decades. Khomeini never forgot it. When Mohammad Reza Pahlavi launched the White Revolution in 1963, things moved even further in a direction Khomeini hated. The White Revolution included land reform, literacy programs, and women's suffrage. That year, women gained the right to vote and run for parliament. In the same period, more girls entered secondary schools. By the 1970s, women were studying law, medicine, and engineering. In 1975, the Family Protection Law expanded women's rights in divorce and child custody. Female judges were appointed. By the late 1970s, Iran had several hundred women serving in the judiciary and thousands working in professional careers. Tehran in the 1970s did not look like a conservative religious capital. It looked modern. Western films were shown in cinemas. Pop music was common. Women appeared on television without headscarves. In upper and middle-class neighborhoods, short coats, styled hair, and cosmetics were normal. Female university enrollment grew quickly. By 1978, women made up around 1/3 of university students in Iran. In big cities, women drove cars, worked in banks, and moved freely in public. Khomeini saw all of this as a warning sign. He believed Western culture was invading Iran through fashion, media, and public mixing of men and women. In his sermons during the 1960s, especially after the Shah granted voting rights to women, he argued that these reforms were not about equality, but about weakening Islam. In 1964, after openly criticizing the Shah and opposing immunity granted to American military personnel in Iran, Khomeini was arrested and then exiled. First, he was sent to Turkey, then to Najaf in Iraq, and later to France in 1978. During those years in exile, he continued speaking about moral corruption and the danger of Western influence. For him, women were not just part of society. They were the foundation of it. He believed the family was the core of an Islamic state, and women shaped the family. If women dressed modestly and stayed within Islamic guidelines, he believed men would behave properly and children would grow up religious. But if women adopted Western fashion and public behavior, he believed it would lead to moral collapse. In his worldview, social decay began with visible immodesty. This idea became central to his political theory. In his 1970 lectures in Najaf, later published as Hukumat-e-Islami Veliyat-e-Faqih, he argued that Islamic governance required full implementation of religious law. That meant laws should not just exist on paper, but shape daily life. Public space had to reflect the Islamic order. You could not claim to have an Islamic state while allowing what he saw as public sin. So by the time mass protests broke out in 1978 against the Shah, Khomeini already had a clear blueprint. He was not thinking about whether to regulate women's appearance. He had decided that years earlier. For him, women's visibility was the clearest symbol of whether society was Islamic or Westernized. When he returned to Tehran on February 1st, 1979, after 15 years in exile, he arrived with millions welcoming him. Within weeks, the monarchy collapsed. On April 1st, 1979, Iran officially became the Islamic Republic after a national referendum. Many people expected political freedom and justice, but Khomeini was focused on reshaping society from the ground up. He believed the revolution would fail if the streets still looked like the Shah's Iran. The revolution had barely settled when the first direct move came. On March 7, 1979, Khomeini declared that women should observe Islamic dress in government offices. This was not yet a formal criminal law passed by parliament, but in revolutionary Iran, his word carried the weight of authority. Ministries, state offices, and public institutions immediately began adjusting their rules. Women working in these spaces were told to cover their hair. The timing was powerful. The next day, March 8th, was International Women's Day. Instead of celebration, Tehran saw protests. Thousands of women gathered in the capital. Many of them had supported the revolution. They had marched against the Shah just months earlier. Now they were marching again, but this time against the direction of the new leadership. From March 8th to March 13th, 1979, demonstrations continued in Tehran and other cities. Women from different backgrounds joined, including students, office workers, leftist activists, and even some religious women who believed hijab should be voluntary, not forced. They feared that what began in government offices would soon spread everywhere. Revolutionary groups and conservative supporters confronted the protesters. Reports from the time describe women being insulted and threatened. Some were called agents of the West. Some were told to either cover themselves or stay home. The tension in the streets grew quickly because the revolution was still fresh, and armed revolutionary committees were active everywhere. What made this moment so important was not just the dress issue itself. It was about who would define public identity in the new Iran. Khomeini wanted the Islamic Republic to look Islamic immediately. Changing economic systems or rewriting full legal codes would take time, but clothing could change overnight. He understood the psychology behind it. If women in government offices appeared with headscarves and long coats within days of his statement, the entire image of authority shifted. Television broadcasts would look different. State buildings would look different. Photographs in newspapers would show a transformed society. That visual shift created the impression that the revolution was not just political, but moral. Public pressure began before any official penal code was written. In many neighborhoods, women without headscarves were verbally attacked. Some faced harassment in public transportation. Social enforcement moved faster than legislation. The atmosphere made it clear that the new system expected visible compliance. This early pressure showed how serious the leadership was. They did not treat women's dress as a secondary issue. It was handled within weeks of taking power. By mid-1979, it was obvious that hijab would not remain optional in state spaces. And once it became normal inside government buildings, extending it to all public areas would become much easier. In 1983, the revolutionary phase was over. The Islamic Republic was no longer just slogans and street power. It had courts, ministries, a parliament, and a legal code. This is when morality moved from pressure to punishment. In 1983, the Islamic Consultative Assembly passed amendments to the Islamic Penal Code that made hijab mandatory in public for all women. Under Article 102 at the time, appearing in public without proper Islamic covering could bring up to 74 lashes. The wording focused on women who appeared in public without the Islamic hijab, and that phrase was interpreted strictly. Hair had to be covered, clothing had to be loose. The body shape could not be visible. Makeup could also bring attention from authorities. This was a turning point. Before this, enforcement depended heavily on revolutionary committees and social intimidation. After 1983, it was backed by criminal law. That changed the entire balance of power. Once something becomes part of the penal code, it stops being advice and becomes an offense against the state. police forces, local revolutionary committees known as comités, and later the regular judiciary, all had legal authority to detain women over dress violation. A woman stopped on the street could be taken to a station, questioned, and brought before a judge. Judges could issue fines, detention, or corporal punishment. In the early 1980s, flogging was not rare for moral crimes. The number 74 was not symbolic. It was an actual sentence that could be carried out. During those years, public punishments were part of the broader revolutionary justice system. Lashings for adultery, alcohol consumption, and moral misconduct were sometimes carried out in open spaces. Crowds were gathered. Announcements were made. Because visibility multiplies impact. If one woman is punished quietly inside a courtroom, only a few people know. If punishment happens in a visible place, word spreads fast. Fear spreads faster than paperwork. The state didn't need to punish thousands publicly. It needed to punish enough so that millions would adjust their behavior. This approach matched the vision of Ruhollah Khomeini. He believed Islamic law had to shape daily life openly. In his view, modesty could not remain a personal preference hidden inside homes. It had to define the streets, the markets, the universities, the buses, and the offices. If someone could openly ignore Islamic dress in public without consequence, that would signal weakness in the system. The early 1980s were also a time when the government was crushing political opposition groups, including leftist organizations and members of the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. Public executions of political prisoners took place during this period. The overall message was strict obedience. Dress codes fit into that larger environment of total control. To understand why women carried this burden, you have to look at how Khomeini defined morality at its root. He believed society functions like a chain. The family sits at the center. Women shape the family. Therefore, women shape society. The idea appears again and again in his speeches and writings before and after 1979. In his thinking, men are visually influenced. If women appear modest, men remain disciplined. If women appear in what he called Western fashion, temptation increases and sin follows. He did not see this as a personal weakness of men. He saw it as a predictable social reaction. So, instead of focusing punishment primarily on men's behavior, the system focused heavily on controlling women's appearance. This belief turned women into what you would call the moral frontline. They were treated as protectors of national virtue. Their clothing became a shield meant to guard society from corruption. If that shield cracked, leaders believed the entire structure could weaken. Inside this framework, a woman showing her hair was not treated as an individual making a personal choice. It was framed as a public act, affecting everyone. In official thinking, it signaled a challenge to Islamic authority. That is why enforcement felt political, not just religious. Making punishment visible reinforced the idea that morality was not optional. If a woman was arrested in a marketplace, other women watching would immediately understand the boundaries. Public enforcement discouraged collective resistance. If small groups tried to ignore dress codes together, visible arrests broke that confidence quickly. Once enough people believed consequences were real, compliance followed. When the Iran-Iraq War began in September 1980, after Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion of Iran, everything inside the country hardened. The war would last until August 1988. Estimates of Iranian deaths range from around 200,000 to possibly 500,000. Entire cities near the border were destroyed. Young men were sent to the front in huge numbers, including teenage volunteers from the Basij militia. In this environment, the leadership framed the conflict as more than a territorial war. It was described as a sacred defense of Islam and the revolution. That language had consequences at home. If the country was fighting for its religious survival, then internal discipline became non-negotiable. Public morality laws grew stricter during these years. Leaders argued that moral unity strengthened soldiers' morale. State media, showed images of veiled mothers holding photos of sons killed in battle. The message was powerful that women must protect the home front with modesty, while men defend the borders with blood. If soldiers were dying in trenches, the leadership insisted that society could not tolerate what they called moral weakness in the cities. Public dress violations were treated as disrespectful to the sacrifices at the front. Punishing women publicly during wartime reinforced that message. It showed that even under invasion, the revolution would not compromise its Islamic principles. Discipline at home matched discipline on the battlefield. Fear also became a tool of loyalty. When people see strict enforcement during a national crisis, many choose silence over confrontation. Wartime conditions reduce tolerance for dissent. Moral policing fit neatly into that climate. By the time the war ended in 1988, a generation had grown up knowing only strict public codes. What began as a revolutionary ideology had become a daily routine. When Ruhollah Khomeini died on June 3, 1989, many people wondered whether strict public morality enforcement would slowly fade. A revolution often softens after its founding leader passes away. That did not happen in Iran. The structure he created was already written into the Constitution, the Penal Code, and the security system. It didn't depend on one man anymore. It had become institutional. After 1989, Ali Khamenei became the supreme leader. The presidency changed hands over the years, but the legal requirements for hijab remained. What changed was the style and intensity of enforcement. In the early 1990s, enforcement still involved regular police and leftover revolutionary committees. But the system gradually became more organized. Public morality was no longer enforced by scattered revolutionary groups alone. It became coordinated through police units trained specifically for monitoring behavior. In 1997, when Mohammad Khatami was elected president, there was a short period of relative social relaxation in large cities. Young women pushed their scarves slightly back. Colorful mantos became common. Makeup became more visible. Enforcement didn't disappear, but it was less aggressive in many urban areas during those years. However, the law itself never changed. The Islamic Penal Code still defined improper dress as an offense. That meant enforcement could tighten at any moment without needing new legislation. That moment came in 2005 when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad became president. Ahmadinejad presented himself as a defender of revolutionary values. Under his administration, the Guidance Patrol, known in Persian as Gast-e-Irshad, became highly visible across major cities. These patrol units operated under the law enforcement command of the Islamic Republic. Their job was to monitor public behavior, especially women's dress. Vans would patrol busy streets, shopping centers, parks, and metro stations. Officers, including female officers, would approach women whose clothing was considered too tight, too short, too colorful, or whose headscarves revealed too much hair. Women were often stopped on sidewalks in front of strangers. They were questioned about their clothing. Some were given warnings. Some were taken into vans and transported to detention centers for a few hours. Inside those centers, they could be required to contact family members to bring more appropriate clothing. In many cases, women had to sign written pledges promising not to repeat the violation. Official police reports from the mid-2000s mentioned tens of thousands of women being stopped each year for dress violations. Many were released the same day, but the process itself was public and humiliating. The goal was not always long-term imprisonment. It was visible correction. Even when corporal punishment was less common than in the early 1980s, the public nature of enforcement stayed central. Women were stopped in crowded places, not hidden back alleys. The arrest itself became the message. The model stayed consistent with Khomeini's original thinking that morality must be supervised where society lives its daily life. Streets, malls, universities, buses, and offices were not neutral spaces. In the ideology of the Islamic Republic, public space reflects Islamic identity. Over time, this enforcement became routine. For an entire generation born after 1989, Seeing morality patrol vans on the streets became normal. Young girls grew up knowing that clothing choices could lead to public confrontation. The public punishment of women was never only about fabric or hair. It was about authority. Every revolution faces the same problem after victory: to prove they are still in control years later. Speeches are not enough. Flags and slogans are not enough. You need daily proof of power. Khomeini understood that from the beginning. He embedded control into something people see every single day. Clothing is unavoidable. It is visible. It cannot hide. If the state can regulate how millions of women dress in public, it demonstrates reach into private life. That reach shows strength. It tells citizens that the government does not only control borders and taxes, it controls behavior. Women became the clearest measure of that reach. A city filled with visibly covered women signaled that the Islamic Republic was intact. If large numbers of women ignored the hijab without consequence, it would signal erosion. Decades passed, but the enforcement logic stayed the same. The pattern repeated. The core structure established in 1979 and formalized in 1983 never disappeared. It adjusted in intensity, but not in principle. By the 2010s and 2020s, younger generations who had grown up entirely under mandatory hijab began openly challenging it. Social media made resistance more visible. Videos of public confrontations with morality patrols circulated widely. Once a state defines its identity through visible moral control, retreat becomes risky. Loosening enforcement can look like weakness. Weakness can invite broader challenges. That is why public punishment persisted long after the revolutionary chaos faded.